Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Zatarain's, a New Orleans tradition since 1889. From our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, this is Louisiana Eats. I'm Poppy Tooker. Did you flunk science in school? It certainly wasn't my strong suit. But if you love to cook, it may surprise you to learn that inherently you're a scientist. There's a lot of science that goes into culinary success, both sweet and savory. On this week's show, we'll turn to some of the world's most renowned experts in food science to uncover some of the greatest technical secrets of the kitchen. We begin with mad scientist Dave Arnold, whose collaborations with Chef Wylie Dufresne have resulted in magical molecular gastronomy. Then we'll go local with New Orleans' own mad scientist of the kitchen, Chef Phillip Lopez of Root and Square Root, and hometown boy and environmental chemist Ted Breaux. Ted's the guy who single-handedly made absinthe legal again in the United States. So get ready to be blinded by science on this week's Louisiana Eats. Dave Arnold can best be described as a mad scientist of the kitchen. What began as a bit of tinkering with found industrial parts turned into a stunning career as a culinary inventor at New York's former Booker and Dax. Alongside his longtime collaborator, Chef Wylie Dufresne, Dave continues to push the limits of what can be done with food. When I met Dave, I had a million questions for him, but first, I asked how his voyage of discovery began. To my surprise, science was not the starting point.
I was supposed to be a science guy. When I showed up in college, though, it's the pull of liberal arts is great, and so, got into philosophy and then ended up getting an MFA in fine arts. Most of my work was building machines, so it's very kind of machine performance heavy stuff. So I always, no matter what I was doing, had a very kind of technical / analytical bent. Most of the cooking stuff I had done had been fairly traditional. So the things that weren't traditional were modifications of equipment that I had. I used to buy restaurant equipment at auction because I couldn't afford real equipment, and I had this artist loft in Manhattan. I didn't have kids yet, so my wife and I were there, and I just had all this space, and so I would go buy commercial equipment, and I'd have it in my apartment, and then I'd say, can I build this, broiler into a rotisserie? Sure. Can I, modify this deep fryer? Sure. You know what I mean? So I would just do all these kinds of things, but the cooking I was doing was still fairly traditional. You know what I mean? Like if I was going to make a donut, I was going to make a donut, but when I met Wylie was really when he kind of showed me that I could use these kind of technical skills and my love of food and learning to kind of use new techniques. He really showed me how low temperature and sous vide stuff worked, or he kind of turned me on to it, because at first I didn't really believe him. I mean, I remember he told me that, he was going to cook pork belly for 3 days, or whatever the number was. I forget whether he was doing a 48 or a 72 hour at the time. And I was like, that's freaking bananas. That's not going to work. You know what I mean? Because intuitively, when you're raised with kind of normal cooking, you tend to think of things becoming overcooked due to time, right? And with low temperature cooking, it's just not the case, right? It's just you have to totally change the way you think about the variables of temperature and time.
Forget the pork belly. To me, like the strangest sous vide tricks, eggs, things that you can do that people could not possibly comprehend.
Yeah, eggs are amazing because they're almost perfect thermometers. So it depends on the range, right? But within the range of 60 and about 65 to 66, I can tell you in some of that range within a half to a quarter of a degree, and in that entire range to within exactly 1 degree of what temperature it was cooked to, just looking at the egg. Because the actual texture of the egg changes so radically over that temperature range. And that's just not stuff you can normally play with normal kind of cooking techniques. You can't, because you don't have that kind of accurate control over the temperature.
Okay, so you're in this loft in Manhattan and you're buying all this used kitchen equipment and you're sort of like the mad scientist at the moment. So what sort of permutations have you done and been through taking equipment and going, can it do this? Will it do that? I think I'll make it do that.
I remember once I found a soft serve ice cream machine on the street.
On the street,
800 pounds, water cooled, and I didn't have the right kind of power. I had it in my apartment because it's an industrial building, but I didn't have it kind of wired the same way. So I literally ran 2 extension cords, like wired the 2 phases together, dropped it onto the thing. It needed to be water cooled, so then I had to like make a hose adapter and screw it onto a faucet, and then siphon the extra out back into my bathtub. And then one of the compressors wasn't working, so I had to jerry rig the compressor to get it to work. And then my wife was like, "What the hell?" It was a huge roach magnet too, because it's this giant 800-pound ice cream machine in this apartment. And so she's like, "You know what? It's like, you can't keep this here."
I love you, baby, but.
Yeah, so we had a giant ice cream party, and then we put it back on the street where it came from. But I used to find on the street, I found a meat slicer on the street, and I brought it back to life. I remember once I was trying to do, this is before there's a thing now called a CVAP oven. It actually was around there, built for Kentucky Fried Chicken. But I was trying to do like a very temperature-controlled humidity box, and so I ripped apart an ultrasonic humidifier and then bought on eBay a bunch of PID temperature controllers and was making these like very accurate humidity box. People do that now all the time. In fact, they did it back then. It's just I didn't know about it because they weren't in fine dining at that time. Those things didn't become popular in fine dining until after the big crackdown on sous vide in 05 or 06 or something like that.
One of the things you've invented that is pretty renowned is the Searsall. Tell us about, what does the Searsall do, Dave?
So most people, especially if you're doing demos or if you're at home or even if you're in a professional kitchen, a lot of times you want very quick application of like high heat to do something, like broil something, finish something, sear something. Problem is, a lot of times you don't have that. It's not available. Either you can't get to the powerful enough burner, you don't have a powerful enough burner, and so a lot of people were using torches for things. Now, a torch is great for crisping up, the sugar on a creme brulee, but when you put a torch onto a piece of meat or things like meat, I always hated it because to me it tasted like someone put a torch on it. It had a very particular thing we called torch taste. And so I was working to try to see, I was mistaken actually of why it would work, but I thought if I spread the flame out a little bit on a mesh that maybe it wouldn't taste bad anymore. And so I just built off that idea. Then I started altering that concept more and more until I came up with the Searsall. And the basic concept is to take the torch flame and turn it into a little mini handheld broiler. Now, it's a small broiler, so you're not going to do a bunch of stuff. But
What's the dimension?
Oh, it's like, what is that, like 3.5-inch circle. So it's small. Plus, it can sear foie gras. It can sear freaking pate, which is crazy. Yeah. It's powerful, but small.
Something that is in every American home kitchen that most cooks look upon disparagingly is the microwave, and you don't feel that way about it, do you?
No, microwave, I mean, look, here's my thing with the microwave. There are people now that have been working on it for the past, number of years, but the microwave is one of those things that got a bad rap because no one bothered to kind of think of the killer app for it yet. Also, I spent almost my whole college career blowing stuff up in microwaves, so I just have a soft spot for microwaves. Using my microwave for food in college was hard because there was all the broken glass and zorched out CDs and vaporized bits of fruit and grape and exploded eggs in them. So it's hard to cook real food in the microwave.
But how has your view on the microwave changed since you have become one of the mad scientists of the kitchen and bar?
I think about it a lot for what it can do. I was trying to once do microwave dehydration. Microwave great for dehydrating herbs. It's one of those things that people think about it as a shortcut tool, and as soon as you think about it as just being a shortcut and you've had too many poorly reheated items, you tend to think that the microwave is somehow the enemy of quality, but it's not that. It's just you haven't thought about it.
So Here's my question for you. We've heard about all of these amazing innovations, some that are in restaurant kitchens, home kitchens. What is your dream for what's coming in the future?
I hope that people stay as creative as they are now. I don't think it's necessarily going to be focused on technology. I think creativity for me has been being very analytical and using techniques, and hopefully that mode of thinking in an analytical way about what you're doing isn't going to go away, because I think it's helpful. But I think it's not going to manifest the same way for everyone. I know people are very interested in fermentation. People are interested in so many different aspects of how they can produce flavor, and my hope is that that's really the fire that's been lit under people's behinds, is this wanting to be creative, wanting to grow, and finding out what interests them and working with that. And so that's kind of what I want to see happen.
Dave Arnold, mad scientist of the food world. A visit with food scientist and scholar Harold McGee is like taking a food chemistry course in culinary success and failure. His 1984 culinary tome on food and cooking remains a kitchen classic for its simple demystification of food chemistry, more than 3 decades after the book's original publication. We spoke with Harold to get a better understanding of the science behind some household staples. I began by asking him to explain the chemical differences between a dark Louisiana roux and a classical French one.
Well, the dark one has basically been cooked more, and that does 3 different things. One is that it changes the color, so instead of being kind of cream colored, it's, whatever shade you want to make it, from light brown to chocolate brown to almost black. It also changes the flavor, because what's happening during that browning process is that sugars are reacting with proteins and generating lots and lots of aromatic molecules. And so the further you carry that cooking, the more aromatic the roux gets. On the other side is the fact that because you're generating all these delicious things from the starch materials, the starch is becoming a less effective thickener. So the darker you cook a roux, the more of it you need in order to get a particular consistency in the soup or the sauce.
I know that salt and acid correct each other. How does that work?
Well, it's a matter of balance. So we have just a handful of basic taste sensations: sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, and umami, which is the savory flavor of meats and fish and things like that. And it turns out that for a dish to taste at its best, all those elements have to be there in some sort of balance. And so if you have a preponderance of one or the other of any of them, adding the others will tend to bring that flavor down and raise the other ones up, and then give you this kind of balanced foundation for whatever the aromas are. I'd hate to lose any of them, but if you lost salt, then you'd be losing not just saltiness, but a general effect that salt has on many aromas as well. It turns out that for a variety of reasons, if you add a pinch of salt to even a sweet dish, that can end up amplifying the aromas in that dish and just make it seem more flavorful. And other taste components don't do that in the same way, so that's an especially valuable property that salt has.
So the way that it amplifies the aromas, is that amplified in the mouth, or is it actually something that you could detect with your olfactory nerves?
It's something that's happening both chemically and in our brains, which is where perception happens. So it turns out that when you add salt to any dish with aroma molecules in it, it turns out that salt makes that dish less chemically hospitable to aroma, which means that the food will release the aroma more easily, which means that there's more of it for us to smell, more of it for us to enjoy. So that's one thing, is the flavor release. And then it also turns out that our brains tend to pay more attention to certain aromas when there are other things going on the taste buds. So if you just smell something, that's one experience the brain is having. But if you smell that same thing at the same time that you're tasting something, then what your brain says, I mean, this is my guess, is you're not just smelling something, you're actually eating something that has nutritional value, and therefore I'm going to have you pay more attention to that flavor. But it does turn out, just objectively speaking, if you give people a flavor with salt and without salt, when it comes with salt, the perception of the aroma, not the saltiness, but the aroma, goes higher.
Something as simple as an egg is really one of the most challenging foods, I think. And I'd like to know, what do you think the biggest mistakes that home cooks tend to make with an egg?
Well, I guess I would say it's not paying close enough attention to the temperature. So it turns out that any protein food like eggs, meats, fish, all of those things where texture is so important and they can dry out so easily or get tough so easily, the key to getting the right texture is temperature. The proteins denature at a very particular temperature and they begin to dry out above that temperature. And that temperature is right around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So anytime you go higher than that, whether it's an egg white or a steak or a piece of fish, you're going to end up with something that's denser and rubberier and tougher and all the things that we don't want.
What do you perceive as some of the most almost magical things that you can see done with an egg?
Well, in a way, it's the range of things that you can do with an egg. The egg has the white and it has the yolk, and you can combine them or you can separate them and take the whites by themselves and take that volume of white, say 2 or 3 egg whites, and you can, just by adding air to it, turn it into a solid foam many times that volume. So it's like eating air, making air into a food. You can raise soufflés and meringues and all kinds of things with that. Or you can take the yolk, which is dense and rich and succulent and full of delicious fat, and make an ice cream that's really rich and kind of melts in your mouth in a way that no Philadelphia-style egg yolk-free ice cream can.
Let me see if you recall this conversation. One of my dear friends, Darren Nesbitt, said that at the time that he was, I believe, at Commander's Palace, you helped him tremendously with a hollandaise problem, and God knows they make vats and vats of it. So I was thinking that you probably might get phone calls or emails from people who say, help!
That one in particular it's a really interesting example, because there is a classical way for making hollandaise where you take the egg yolks and heat them very gently on their own with some vinegar just until they begin to thicken, and then you add the clarified butter drop by drop in order to make the sauce. Turns out, if you think about the chemistry of hollandaise and exactly what's happening, you can do the following. You can take all the ingredients, the eggs, the butter, the vinegar or the lemon juice, cold, put them into a cold saucepan, turn the heat on, start stirring, and in 5 minutes the sauce makes itself. And it's a wonderful thing. It's one of those things where you just feel as though nature is on your side for a change. If the butter is in chunks and you haven't gone to all the trouble of clarifying it, and you start to heat it that way in the egg yolks, while the egg yolks are getting warm enough to begin to thicken, the butter is very slowly melting and releasing itself gradually into the eggs at just about the same rate that the eggs are thickening. And so you've got these two different processes which classically you take control of and you do them separately, and that has all kinds of problems, or you can let the ingredients kind of take care of themselves. And it's a relief to every professional chef I've told that.
That is an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us on Louisiana Eats.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Poppy. Anytime.
Food scientist and scholar, Harold McGee.
Give me the scientist, always stuck on, always trying this. I try to live on science alone now.
When we come back from a short break, we'll join Chef Phillip Lopez in the science lab he calls a kitchen to learn how he blends physics and chemistry to create experimental menus. Stay tuned.
I am a scientist. Yeah, I am a scientist. We gotta live on science alone now.
I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Rouse's Markets and from Brennan's Restaurant. Breakfast at Brennan's, featuring Chef Slade Rushing's updated classic Creole cuisine. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and private events at 417 Royal Street in the historic French Quarter. Chef Phillip Lopez has created a playground for molecular gastronomy in his New Orleans restaurants, Root and Square Root. We join the culinary chemist in his kitchen at Root to learn about the science behind some of his most inventive dishes.
Chef Phillip, to tell you the truth, I'm shocked now that I finally got in the kitchen because I had imagined that it was going to be more like a science lab, and this looks like a pretty regular kitchen to me.
It does, but in all actuality, every kitchen's got to have certain equipment that you're going to need to cook, food. And so it's all about the organization. And we have smokers back there, we have dehydrators, we have cotton candy machines, we have immersion circulators. At the end of the day, it's all about real food, and that's what we try to serve here. But, the molecular gastronomy part of it is really just the fun quirkiness that runs through my head.
Okay, so you've described some of your toys to us. Now, tell us how you play with those toys and what you do with them.
Well, I teach these guys that everything that they put their hands on, whether it be a piece of parsley or, a lobe of foie gras, everything has to be utilized in more than one way. So when it comes to parsley, we would pick the leaves off the parsley, we would juice the parsley, we would take the stems and we would sous vide them actually, and then dehydrate them and grind them up into powders. And so you're able to stretch your items a little bit further, but yet you're also creating more textures and different variables within the food. And so I can make a parsley scented ravioli, but then also have parsley powder on the plate, parsley paint to paint the plate with. So there's different aspects to all these ingredients. And we always talk about how it doesn't matter the actual value that you pay for your ingredient, it's everything's on the equal same playing field. And so whether it be a peach or a lobster tail, they're both as equal of value in the kitchen as anything else. And so it is your job as a chef to make sure that you create this dish surrounding this peach to make it as awesome as this lobster. And that is our job as a chef every day in this kitchen, and that's what we strive for.
Okay, let's discuss some of your menu items in particular. And I know you've got a fish dish that you garnish with pine needle pearls. Yeah. What are pine needle pearls and how do you make them?
Well, to tell you the truth, these pine needle pearls are actually made from spherification. There's a company based out of California that I get a lot of essence from. Now, there's a machine, all right, it's called a rotovap, which is really more like of a distillery. And so I can take items such as pine and distill it into an essence. And so this company produces these essences for me, and then I can take this pine essence and flavor different ingredients. So we make this pine stock, and then we add chemicals to it in order to make these little pearls. And so we add the stock to a syringe, and then we pipe the little pearls into a calcium bath, which creates this small little gelatin sphere outside, and then this little gooey, ooey texture on the inside. And then so we add another stabilizer to that in order for us to heat it up in a pan. And it's quite interesting, the texture of it, because it's almost like pine caviar.
It is.
And there's also another method too that we use, and we use a type of tapioca starch, and we create our own tapioca pearls using pine essence into that too as well. So,
One of the biggest surprises I ever found on the dinner table was a cigar box. And inside that cigar box were Cohiba smoked scallops. Now, how do you get the smoke in there?
Well, we use a little tool called the smoking gun, and you can find it anywhere. You can find it at Williams-Sonoma. You can order it online. It's a little handheld device, and you can put all kinds of different ingredients in it. You can put wood, cigar. Sometimes you can put dehydrated mint leaves, and so we tried to play around with different items to smoke with. And growing up, my father used to smoke cigars before I was born, and so it kind of gave me the inspiration to use cigar smoke in this dish. And I've always been outward thinking, outside of the box, and so anytime I go into the outside world, and I mean outside of the kitchen, I always try to find items and different tools to use as a presentation or as a vessel for the dish. And it just so happened that the smokiness of the cigar and the sweetness of the scallop work hand in hand. And to serve it in a cigar box, I mean, why not?
That's a crazy, crazy thing. Now, speaking of crazy things, tell us about the wild things that you're up to with foie gras.
Oh my gosh. One of the fun ideas I got from the chefs at El Bulli, they were turning different kinds of fats into spun sugar. So they were taking olive oil and making it into, olive oil cotton candy or olive oil sugar. And, it just kind of blew my mind. And so it's just like, like if you're making a caramel at home, Poppy, you take your sugar, you bring it up to a hard crack stage, and then you incorporate cream and butter and all that good stuff into it. Well, this is the same philosophy. It's just a little bit more refined and a little bit more on a molecular stage, because you're actually taking chemicals and mixing it with other items in order to incorporate the two together. Now, anybody would have thought, man, how can you put foie into sugar? Because it's like a fat substance. Well, it's almost like making a vinaigrette. You're taking a vinegar and you're taking an oil and you're emulsifying it together. So we take this foie fat, which we render out, and so it's in a liquid state. We add a chemical to that, and then we take sugar and we add a chemical to that. Now, those two chemicals in each ingredient will help stabilize the two together. And so we bring them both up to a certain temperature, we combine them two together, and voila, we have a foie caramel.
And how do you serve that?
Well, believe it or not, we take that foie caramel and we break it up and we grind it into a powder to make a candy. And that we spin in a cotton candy machine. So now we have foie gras cotton candy. Now, that's all great and all, but we have to put a little bit more substance inside of it. So what we did is we took a foie mousse, which we studded with strawberry pop rocks, and then we wrapped the whole thing in foie cotton candy. So now you have essentially a foie pop. Is what I like to call it. Everyone's grown up eating lollipops, and so this is a little bit more of a grown-up style lollipop right here.
That's wild. Okay, let's move on to dessert.
Oh.
You're making your own Cocoa Puffs?
Yes, we are. Now, the actual technique I cannot release because there's been so many people trying to get this recipe. Now, it involves corn flakes, okay? It has to involve dark chocolate and dark cocoa powder. And so there's a technique that we use to incorporate that, and we make Cocoa Puffs from the cornflakes. We then wrap it or coat it in the dark chocolate. Being a chef, we work constantly. We do long hours. And so when we go home at the end of the night, we really don't feel like cooking. So this dish is actually inspired by the lack of having ingredients in your house to make food. And usually I have a box of cereal and some milk, so I'm always eating a bowl of cereal when I go home. So I'm thinking, why can't I incorporate that into a dessert? We actually take the Cocoa Puffs, we serve it with mint chocolate chip ice cream. We do a house-made York peppermint patty, and then we serve it with minted milk. And to mix all that together is just absolutely amazing.
What inspires your work?
Well, I can tell you, everything inspires me. I mean, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep, I mean, every second of the day is an inspiration. And whether it's a flash of light or whether it's, different colors put together, everything has to be an inspiration. And, it's weird because sometimes a dish just comes to me or it comes to us in the kitchen. We're all sitting there talking, goofing around, and then somebody brings up the idea of, steak tartare. And then I'm like, oh my God, what if we could do this or what if we could do that? And what if we can change this and turn it around? And so it's really a culmination of my teachings and my philosophy and then everyone's ideas put together. And I love this restaurant because it gives us the opportunity to just play around with so much stuff.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing some of your scientific tricks you've got going on in the kitchen here.
It was my pleasure, Poppy. I really appreciate it.
Chef Phillip Lopez, playful scientist and chef at his restaurant Playground, root, and square root.
We're in the building where they make us grow, and I'm frightened by the liquid engineers like you.
We now turn to a different kind of chemist, environmental chemist Ted Breaux, whose scientific curiosity and quest for truth helped bring about the legalization of absinthe in the U.S. after a century of prohibition. We sat down with the New Orleans native to discuss his journey resurrecting a drink with such a frightening reputation.
You know, the thing about it is I've studied absinthe for over 20 years now. And that's one of those words that just sort of maybe stuck somewhere in the back of my mind. And it was when I was working in a research lab 20 years ago, and a colleague of mine mentioned absinthe in a passing comment that it sort of struck a chord. And I asked him, I said, yeah, absinthe, what exactly was that? And he said, you know, it's that green liquor that made people crazy. And my question to him was, really? I said, well, you know, we analyze things for a living, so what was in it that made people crazy? Oh, I don't know, you know. I could find very little information on it. I looked at my trusty Merck Index, which is like the Bible of chemistry. Every chemist has a copy of this book. And my special edition actually had an entry for absinthe in there, and it said, drinking absinthe can cause tremors, convulsions, death. Mm-hmm. I was really? I was like, what, you know, why? How could this stuff be so great and people loved it, and yet it caused tremors, convulsions? Something doesn't add up. And I don't like unsolved mysteries. And I wanted to know what was in this stuff. And back in those days, there wasn't any absinthe to be had.
No. What year was this?
This was in like 93, 94.
Okay.
And then in 2000, I became the first person to actually take samples from sealed vintage bottles of absinthe and analyze them using modern science.
Yeah, tell me that. You did something called mass spectrometry?
Mass spectrometry. And I realized that if there's something that's really wrong with this, there's something deleterious or hallucinogenic or psychoactive or something that's going to support the allegation, you know, something there. It's there, and I'm going to see it.
Yes.
And I analyzed it, and I even sent samples to the lab of an associate, a third-party lab, had them analyze it. And we both came up with the same answer. There's nothing wrong with it. Nothing. Mm-hmm. Which was, wow, okay. Well, that just undermines all these allegations and years and decades of smear, you know.
Well, they always thought it was the thujone levels, right?
Right. Well, that was the whole prevailing belief. But lo and behold, there was really none of this substance to be found. I mean, trace amounts that are so small, insignificant.
Wow.
And thujone isn't hallucinogenic. It doesn't have any recreational potential. That's all made up anyway. And I said, okay, I've analyzed these bottles. I can't find anything wrong with them. So what's the source of the controversy? And what I would eventually discover is that the answers wouldn't be found inside the bottle, but those answers were rooted in politics and economics and societal issues of the day. You know, today when we go out and buy a bottle of bourbon whiskey, to call something bourbon whiskey, it has to be produced in accordance to certain rules because there is a legal definition that defines what bourbon whiskey is.
Correct.
And without that, you could put anything in a bottle and call it bourbon. But fortunately, we have a definition, and that protects both consumers and the industry. Well, we do not have a definition for absinthe. Anyone can put anything in a bottle and call it absinthe, and there's nothing legally to stop them. And this is true not only here in the United States, but in Europe as well. And there is still a void of a legal standard of identity.
That is so interesting.
Well, back in the days of Upton Sinclair, when basically everything was caveat emptor, people in 19th century France, for example, were very brand conscious when it came to buying absinthe, and they had to be because there were so many. When absinthe became very, very popular, naturally there was a competitive drive to make it cheaper.
Yeah.
And there were profiteers who did exactly that. And they were using industrial alcohol, which is unfit for human consumption. They were artificially coloring it with copper sulfate. They were adding antimony trichloride, very poisonous, to make it artificially cloud when ice water was added because consumers expected that. These products were aimed at poor alcoholics. And it's these poor alcoholics that were drinking these really bad, adulterated, cheap versions of the drink. And they were the ones that were ending up with like symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, symptoms that were unlike normal alcoholism. And basically, the enemies of absinthe, and most notably at that point, the wine industry, there was a big economic incentive for them to blame all societal ills on absinthe. Never mind that you could just go out and freely buy products that contained opium and morphine and even heroin and cocaine. This wasn't a problem, you see, because, well, Sigmund Freud himself said that cocaine was a wonder drug. But absinthe was the real root of all societal ills. I came to a crossroads. I had all this information from analyzing vintage absinthe. And my first impulse was, well, I'm going to take this and write a book, which would be great.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, wait a minute. But then you still have just a book. And I think what people really want is to taste vintage absinthe the way it tasted in the 19th
They
century.
want the drink.
So I said, here's what I'll do. I'll keep some of those details to myself. And what I'll do is I'll actually reproduce some of these original brands. I have the information to do it.
And so then you connect with Garrett Gerfine.
Yes.
He was your legal beagle who came along to help you because he wanted to make absinthe too, right?
Basically, his proposal to me was, look, I can put the legal machine together to get your science in front of the U.S. government, and we can settle this once and for all. Because anyone that tried to bring an absinthe in the country at that point, they just said no.
Right.
And hoped that they would go away. And, of course, they did. And, we knew that we would have to be prepared to fight a battle of attrition. And it was quite interesting because the problem wasn't really with the juice, with the liquid. We could prove it was safe scientifically. They knew it was safe. They knew there was nothing wrong with it. Their concern was, what will consumers think? How will you market this? Are you going to market this like a drug? And it was quite interesting because I remember there was an energy drink that was on the market at that time. It wasn't on the market very long. And the brand name was cocaine.
I remember that.
You remember that?
Yeah.
It's like, now, don't you think consumers would be somewhat disappointed when they find out there's no cocaine actually in it? So, our discussion with them was basically all about explaining that, look, we're not here to do what these profiteers have done and put these, mouthwash-like products in the market, slap a label on it that says absinthe and try and sell it as something that's going to create hallucinations, which is obviously a lie.
Yeah.
What we want to do is return absinthe to a respectable position on the bar as it was in every pre-prohibition bar. I mean, when you look at the most comprehensive bartending guide possibly in existence, the Savoy Cocktail Book, 1930, published in London, there are over 100 cocktails in that book that call for absinthe. And absinthe can be found in cocktails in every classic cocktail book prior to the ban. And that's where we wanted to return absinthe. And it took many months to convince the U.S. government. And that was March 5th, 2007, when they finally said, okay. And they allowed Lucid Absinthe Superior to become the first genuine absinthe sold in the United States since 1912. And it's been incident-free.
Environmental chemist and absinthe authority, Ted Breaux.
I can't have you, you're so illegal, intoxicating to me. Where else can we go to find out if it's ice and booze?
Why do apples float? Stay tuned. We'll solve that mystery when we come right back.
I'm not even missing you.
I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Zatarain's, and from French Market Coffee. French Market Coffee's premium blended beans are locally roasted in small batches, creating a coffee that can only be called New Orleans bold.
Two scientists are racing for the good of all mankind. Both of them side by side, so determined.
Here's this week's culinary quiz question, brought to you with support from Popeye's Louisiana Culinary Institute. Why do apples float? Apple cells are filled with flavorful juices comprised of water, sugar,
acids and aromatic esters, which are compounds made up of one acid and one alcohol molecule. The spaces between an apple's cells are filled with air, which accounts for as much as 25% of the volume of a ripe apple, which is why they float. In ripe apples, the cells bulge with juice, stretching the cell walls and compressing the air between the cells. When you take a bite, the cell walls break. That's where the crispness comes in, as the juices burst out. Now catch this scientific magic. When you bite that crisp apple, the air trapped between the cells is released, transporting the apple's aromatic esters up the back of your throat to the olfactory membranes in your nose, which is how you then fully taste the distinctive flavor of whatever apple variety you're eating. I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats. If you live in or have visited New Orleans, especially around carnival season, you may have spotted a mobile hydration clinic driving around. This doctor's office on wheels is an extension of the Remedy Room, a clinic specializing in infusion therapy to aid in rehydration and detoxification. But as founder, Dr. Mignon Mary explains, there's more to what they do than just help people recover after a long night out.
I think we need to change the tagline to it's not just about hangovers, but certainly we treat people for dehydration for whatever the cause. Whether you're coming back from a trip from Mexico, we had some racers this week, and then we have people who have chronic disease, who have chronic GI conditions like Crohn's, or maybe they've had bariatric surgery. So for whatever reason, they would be malnourished or needing a nutrient boost.
It's amazing what incredibly terrible things vitamin deficiencies can do to your body.
I think we live in a world that's keeping us from being well because we're toxic, right? So after 40, we're starting to see more, I see a lot more women than men, but men are having the problem too, where we live in this environment that's toxic. The food we're eating isn't the best. Even if we eat from great sources, the minerals are not in the soil. And so we're deficient in a lot of vitamins. And even if we draw the blood levels, we may not be off the radar or low enough to be considered deficient on an insurance paper. But if you replenish that vitamin, the patient gets better or the patient can heal. And so it's either going to be dehydration, a nutritional deficiency, or hormonal imbalance, or a toxicity issue. And once we clear those up, then I feel the body can do its thing, and the immune system can kind of pick up the pieces and heal.
You and I were talking not too long ago, and you spit out some crazy statistic about women and how many different chemicals we've applied someplace or another before we walk out the door in the morning.
Yeah, by the time we're done putting on hairspray and our makeup and our skin cream and our sunscreen and our perfume and the body soap that we got from a store that smells delicious, we have over 250 chemicals on our body. And the skin is our biggest organ. So we're absorbing that, and then we're having to deal with that toxic load. So again, I always talk about 40 after 40, but it's because as we age, we're not able to deal with the toxic buildup. That's when we start to feel the effects. When we're young, we have a lot of growth hormone. We're super healers. We are, kind of curing ourselves overnight. But as we age, because the toxic burden gets so high and we don't have as many antioxidants, we don't produce as many, and probably because our diet now has accumulated and gotten worse as well, we're not able to get past that toxic burden. So then we start to feel sick. We're either tired or some of those other hormonal complaints where we don't have good skin turgor or our hair is falling out. Or the biggest complaint I can tell you I see is that people are just, in general, they're exhausted. And it's multifold, but it does come down to what we're eating. So your probably not going to escape this year without hearing about the microbiome or about the GI tract or the gut. But 80 to 90% of the serotonin, which is our happy hormone, is made in the gut. So what we eat matters the most. And not only what we eat, but the foods we eat need to be the least inflaming foods. So we live in the most amazing food city in the world, but if we can avoid the foods that cause inflammation and raise our insulin levels, then we can reduce the damage that it does to not only the body, but to the brain. And we can keep the good gut flora, the good microbiome growing. So insulin is the most atherogenic or plaque-forming and harming hormone, but we need it, right? We can't live without it. But we don't need to have it coming out as often, and the way to do that is to focus more on the vegetables and the good healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, coconut oil, even ghee. And then if you are going to eat meat or fish, then hopefully it's from sources that are going to be the least inflaming, so grass-fed and organic and those things that have the least toxicity. So if you can't get to that phase yet, and that's not, you're not able to shop at Whole Foods or at your local market, then start with just reducing the breads and reducing the pastas where you can. So wherever you can reduce the inflaming foods and maybe budget them for another time, I think it's all about budgets. And now that we live in this really tight economy, people know about budgeting. I tell them to do the same thing with their sugars. And so if we can get away from the sugar, the more you get away from it, the less you will want it. But you need to go up on the good fat to sustain you so that you're not hungry for it. And that's where the big difference is in the newer studies showing that fat can keep you full. And I think we're kind of going back in time like we always do. Everything repeats itself. We're going back to the way our great-great-grandparents used to eat, where we use the lard, we use the good fats, and we aren't so afraid of it anymore.
So for people who are trying to lose weight, is there something in this panoply of hormones and various things that one needs to be aware of and concerned about besides insulin?
The next would be vitamin D. So I think that it should be considered a pro-hormone instead of a vitamin. Now, we do have to be careful of it because it's fat-soluble, so you can overdose. But there seems to be a scourge these days where almost everyone I check is low. And if you are, under 30, you're going to need to load that vitamin. If I had one lab test to check on everyone, I'd pick vitamin D. And then if I had two, I'd pick fasting insulin and D, because those are two things that I would do something differently in my management. I would certainly replace, and then I would tell people not to be so afraid of the sun. For a good 20 minutes a day, we can go and get some sunshine without being burned. The burning of the skin is sort of the body's red light to say, okay, you've had enough, right? So I'm not a big fan of slathering sunscreen, but I am a fan of getting enough vitamin D and trying to convert on your own through your skin.
Dr. Mignon Mary, founder and primary physician of the Remedy Room. That's it for this week's edition of Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Have you missed an episode of Louisiana Eats? Hear today's show or catch up on previous editions anytime online at itsneworleans.com, where you can also subscribe to the podcast and take us with you wherever you go. If you love Louisiana Eats, let others know and help like-minded Louisiana food lovers find our show by leaving a review on iTunes. Louisiana Eats is made possible with major support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Zatarain's, French Market Coffee, and Rouse's Markets. Additional support for Louisiana Eats is provided by the Shreveport-Bossier Convention and Tourist Bureau and from Tableau, Dickie Brennan's latest restaurant serving local Creole cuisine with a view of Jackson Square. Original theme music by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Big thanks to producers Joe Schreiner, Sarah Holtz, and Reggie Morris, and to our business manager and social media maven, Maddie Mullidew. Come visit us anytime in our Louisiana Eats studios at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. Don't forget to find our recipes and see what we're up to at poppytooker.com. You can check us out on Instagram and Facebook too. I'm Poppy Tooker. Louisiana Eats is a production of Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.